What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, episode number 5. Today, to my right, I'm joined, as always, by Michael Murray. Mike, how you doing today?
Doing fantastic, Cole. How are you?
I'm doing well. And to my left we have Artem Imnadze, a doctor of physical therapy, recent graduate from Alvernia University. Artem, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
So today, we are lucky to be joined by Artem, and so we want to get Artem's background and kind of where he started from, and kind of on the whole path that's been made to lead you where you are today in physical therapy.
Yeah,
So you kind of want to open up.
absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. So I don't even know where to start. I feel like this is never talk about myself too often. So I originally started as a personal trainer when I was in undergrad, and I went into undergrad with the idea that I was going to be like a business major, just because I didn't really know what I was going to do, and that seemed like a pretty broad scope field, and I was like, oh, I'll just do that. And then at the same time, I was getting pretty heavily into exercise. I had a training partner that we train every day, and we're super into it. Watched a lot of YouTube. And he actually was a year ahead of me, so he went into school for kinesiology with the plan of being a physical therapist. I'm not really sure why he chose it, but that's what he chose. So we talk about school all the time, and he would tell me classes he was taking, and I was like, that sounds fucking awesome. That sounds way cooler than anything that I would be taking. And as my love for exercise and fitness grew, I decided that sounded like it was going to be a good field for me. So I ended up switching my major to that, going into undergrad, and then at the same time, I started personal training. I worked at a private studio, and then developed my skills as a coach there. I did some strength coaching with athletes, and then I worked with just general adults for fitness and health. And I did that all through undergrad, developed my skills, and really throughout the whole time, I just tried to be as good as I possibly could be. I tried not to be complacent. I saw that the trainers at LA Fitness are the big box gyms, and I'm like, wow, they're doing a really shitty job, and I want to be a lot better than them. So I would try to educate myself as much as I could, whether it was through reading, online resources, going to courses, things like that. And then eventually I got into PT school at Alvernia. Luckily, I got picked off the waiting list, so it was the luckiest thing ever. And then I continued the training and the self-education throughout, and I ended up landing a pretty stellar internship while I was in PT school in Indianapolis. The place was called iFast. And it was a guy named Bill Hartman, who I ended up doing the mentorship with for 12 weeks. And to me, he's probably the most brilliant mind in at least orthopedic or sports physical therapy. So I was lucky enough to spend that time with him and learn. And one of the biggest takeaways from that for me was in PT school, they provide you with basic skills kind of for you to not kill anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But they never provide you with an actual treatment model, a model in which you can take other sources, other tools, and fit those things into your model. They give you separate skills, but never provide the cohesiveness of each skill and where they would fit into. So luckily, I was able to get that from Bill, and I was able to adapt his model and then make it my own. And then ever since I finished that internship and finished school, I've been able to develop that model and kind of mold it into my own model, not necessarily just copy exactly what he's done.
Right.
So that's kind of been my journey. Right now, I'm in a private outpatient, out-of-network practice where I work primarily with active adults, athletes, high school, college, and semi-professional. So it's been a good ride so far.
Did you know prior to working in the setting you're working now, going into PT school, is that where you wanted to go all along? Or did you find throughout your process you were surprised to like certain things versus like having biases going in that changed?
I was definitely very biased going in because this place I'm working in now, I found this place through Clinical Athlete before I even got into PT school, and I needed like volunteer hours. So like I reached out to them, and it was like 3 months into like my current boss opening the practice, and I was like, hey, can I come hang out, like just see what you're doing? And it was like a totally different environment than I've ever been in before because it was cash based at the time, one-on-one. So like very different from your typical like big like mill type physical therapy clinics. So I developed a relationship with him through like shadowing. And I would help him out with certain events that he was doing, and I just kept that relationship going throughout PT school. Like every break I would get, I would go and visit the clinic, kind of see what they were doing, learn from them. And throughout that time, he had expanded, adding PTs, expanding the facility that he's at. So in my mind, my entire PT like school career, that's like exactly where I wanted to be. And there was like no guaranteed spot for me or anything like that. But he was actually the one that recommended that I apply to IFAST too.
Oh wow!
So he, like my current boss, is responsible for that. So after I got back from IFAST, they kind of reached out to me, and luckily for me, they were looking for another therapist, and we kind of talked, and obviously it's exactly what I wanted, exactly where I wanted to be, and they needed someone like me, so I was able to come onto the team. So yeah, I kind of knew exactly what I wanted to do going in. So that kind of biased me towards not liking anything else.
Yeah, that's fair. Mike, did you have anything specifically you wanted to ask Artem about his background?
Before we get into the more specific questions, if you want, would you like to elaborate on the model you've developed, or like the core principles of like what you learned from Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. So if any of your listeners are familiar with like PRI, like the Postural Restoration Institute.
Any of our two listeners just asking them PRI?
Singing the part right now.
Well, yeah. Oh shit, that's me. Well, a lot like their model is based around like respiration as a model of like how the human body functions, just because it is the basic principle of life. Like you have to be able to breathe to live. But there are certain like certain things that happen anatomically and physiologically when you breathe, like with ventilation, respiration. When you breathe, your entire body moves. Just look in the mirror and watch yourself as you take a big inhale. You'll see your rib cage expand, and with that come relative motions of all the other limbs attached to your axial skeleton. So that's basically the premise of the model, based around respiration. It is a big driver of anatomical changes. How you breathe is how you move, pretty much, is simply put. And then physiologically, obviously, there are like neurological things that happen, hormonal things that happen when you breathe. Just like the concept of like when you're stressed, people tell you to take a few breaths, and within a few breaths, you could change your entire physiology, right? That's kind of I tend to veer more towards like the anatomical changes that happen. I don't like to get into like the neurology aspect of it or anything like that, just because that can get convoluted and you can't really measure it, or I can't measure it in the clinic, so I don't really care about it. But those things like do happen. But the basis of Bill's model is kind of it started off as sort of like the PRI model, and then he's built and enhanced that model, in my opinion, and made it more simple. So a big part of it is this concept of simple rules repeated. So everything in human nature, especially the human organism, has to be cohesive. So like if you dial it down to like a single-celled organism functions exactly like a human organism, right? Just at a smaller scale. Okay, so there are two basic principles, or two basic ways that humans move, and it's expansion and compression, right? So with respiration, expansion would be inhalation, right? And compression would be exhalation. And with those, you can apply those to any sort of movement. So think of like a single joint movement, like an elbow flexion movement. So your biceps forming the elbow flexion. So during that movement, the biceps is concentrically orienting and it's compressing, right? The unit is getting smaller. And during elbow extension or active elbow extension, your biceps is eccentrically orienting, right? It's increasing in volume and size, or it's expanding. And again, those are synonymous with inhalation and exhalation, expression or compression and expansion. So when you look at human movement, you can dial it down to those two simple movements. You're either compressing or expanding, and that's really like the basis of the model. And you can just use it. You can look at different movements that way. Muscle contractions. Any other questions?
I think we'll leave it at that, right? Because
Because we could talk about it for
and then it just is not necessary to go into like super detail about that stuff.
But yeah, I think it's a broad overview of that model.
Yeah, it just comes down to two different strategies: compression, expansion, and it's never one or the other. There's always it's always an overlap.
Beautiful. All right, let's get into some more specific questions and kind of finding this connection between the PT realm and being healthy, but also getting as strong and jacked as possible. And I'm super excited for this conversation. Not so much because you're that interesting, but because I haven't had the opportunity to really sit down and jam on anything with you in a while. You recently, you're studying for your exam, you're in PT school, you recently got married. And whether you specifically know this or not, and a big reason why Emily's super excited for this conversation is that the birth of my scientific mindset, I actually attribute to you.
Oh.
And I'm sure you're already visualizing Mike from, what would it be, maybe 4 years ago?
Probably. Like
4
2015, probably 2014, 2015.
4 years ago, being a young, strapping bodybuilder with not a great head on
Use the
his
term strapping loosely.
not a great head on his shoulders. At our previous gym we both trained out of, and basically through a mutual friend of ours, kind of like, hey man, what the hell are you doing? And then me not being able, basically, I was not able to provide a strong reason for anything I was doing. It was just like, what is Kai Green doing for workouts? What is Dorian Yates, the PB back in the day? I didn't really know anything. I wasn't into science and read. You showed me a couple of resources, and from there, it just expanded into this increasingly skeptical mind. And the more I learned, the more I realized nothing. And where I said, it all started because of you, man.
Oh, well, glad I could do something valuable in your life.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
I wish I didn't. I would have loved to see what.
Yeah, if you could just give us your first impressions on Mike Mary from afar, when you're just like, who is this guy over here? What's going on with him? Just so we can get an idea of that.
So at the time, I was like powerlifting. So I was very biased towards like big compound barbell movements. Like I thought that was life. And if you didn't train those, you're a fucking idiot. And what I would see when Mike would come into the gym was he would come in, first of all, had a belt on for every single movement that he did, like a weightlifting belt for no reason. He was coming in and doing pretty much all like single joint, like isolation exercise. Isolation used loosely. Single joint actually, he would come in and his back day started with like some cable row or something like that. I'm like, what the fuck is this guy doing? Why does he deadlift? And I would see this every day, like zero compound movements, nothing like that. And then me and my buddy, who is our mutual friend, who is also very biased towards that kind of training, we're just like, dude, what are you doing, man? Like, how do you expect to grow if you're just doing all this stuff? And then obviously, like looking back on it, it's not necessarily the wrong way to train.
Right.
But it was just at the time, like my biases led me to that conclusion, and I felt like I had to intervene before things got out of hand, before you just didn't grow.
but also there's like an inherent issue in that. So as we're saying, like, you know, how my workouts started or whatever back then, it wasn't technically wrong, right? And you had that bias, but it was wrong in the sense where if you were literally like, what are you doing?
Right.
And I could not justify that. Whereas if someone saw me in the gym today, and I would probably do that again. Now as like a more educated bodybuilder, like maybe I would start with like some sort of isolation.
Yeah.
Like, but someone could ask me, and I would have like a very strong reason for doing so, and the rationale makes sense, and I could explain what I was doing. So like in that sense, I'm like,
yeah. So there's no reasoning and there's no intent behind it.
And that's what the issue was.
Like no structure either. So it's just like, okay, maybe like you needed structure basically.
Absolutely.
You needed me in your life.
And it's helped.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad, man. It's been a long journey.
All right. So as the first question we'll get into is, let's just talk about what the more or less typical adaptations or physiological responses to what we call traditional bodybuilding or powerlifting training, as Mel liked to call it last week, training that you do in a telefit. What are the typical responses to that training?
Okay, so you're primarily talking about like sagittal plane biased.
Yeah, so you're being a sagittal robot. How do certain mobility restrictions result from that?
Yeah. So typically, obviously, most especially powerlifting is going to be biased towards barbell, bilateral barbell movements within the sagittal plane. Bodybuilding, you get some more variation there, but primarily, like when going back to that model of expansion and compression, heavy weightlifting is going to be biased towards more compression. Obviously, a more concentric orientation of musculature, especially when you think bilaterally. You have certain adaptations that happen going back to that set principle. Your body's going to get better at what you do consistently. So generally, like humans have 3 planes of movement. Yeah, like the sagittal, the frontal, and transverse. Because all training is done in the sagittal plane, your body's going to get really good at that. And in order to get really good at that, it has to have less things to control. So take like rotation, for example. Typically, you expect all humans to rotate globally, like trunk rotation, and then think of like isolated, like hip rotation, internal, external, shoulder rotation, internal, external. Okay, in order for you to accomplish your big lifts with a lot of weight, you have to be able to control that rotation, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you start rotating your heavy barbell, bad things, right? Primarily, one, you can miss a lift, or you can get injured. You can never really truly predict like injuries, but typically if you have a shit ton of weight on your back on a barbell and you start twisting, bad things are going to happen. So your body has to learn how to control that. So what it does is it drops off that rotation to give you less things to control. You lock yourself into a single plane, which you are moving in primarily. So that ability to rotate is lost. That's the primary thing that you typically see, and it's because training is also like if you do take the rotation component, training is mostly biased towards external rotation. Think like when you squat, you have your knees out, you're trying to externally rotate, for example. So you'll have this sagittal plane dominant movement with a bias towards external rotation. So internal rotation is typically the first thing to lose, right? Shoulder, hip, internal rotation. And then trunk rotation as a whole is lost. And as you see these, like people like you, for instance, like you've been training for a while, like I've seen you on the table, like I've checked your gross ranges of motion. As you go further down the road, you just drop off your ability to internally rotate, externally rotate. So what that would mean is you're driving further and further into compression, right? So now all you have is the ability to move into flexion or extension, right? And then as you keep going further and further into training, you're going to lose that ability as well. So you literally just lose your ability to just move at the joints.
So based off of that, tell me about so we know that these are adaptations to the training you're doing, and in that sense, it's at a certain level beneficial, right? It's making you better at the specific training that you're doing. But is there potential increased risk for injury, or let me phrase this another way: if the bodybuilder powerlifter did incorporate movements in other planes of motion, such as the frontal plane, would this decrease the risk of injury? Because I forget the paper, but basically it looked at the injury occurrence across different sports. So like, we know that the risk for injury in a real sport like soccer, where you're moving through all three planes of motion, compared to something like Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, even bodybuilding, the risk is very high for sports like that. Whereas even bodybuilding compared to weightlifting or powerlifting, bodybuilding has the lowest risk of injury.
Yeah.
So based off of that, would you say, since it is at a very basic level, such low risk, would you say that we can decrease the risk of injury further by incorporating more planes of motion? Or would you even say that because it's so low, you're probably fine just being a savage robot as long as that's all of what you're doing? Personally, right now, I will not do other forms of activity because of like the risk of injury. So like because I'm so dedicated to bodybuilding, like doing a show down the road, I won't go and play rec basketball because I think my risk of injury is now incredibly high.
Yeah.
And conversely to that, I do play rec basketball every Sunday morning, and that's like my only form of other activity that occurs.
For
basically,
the purpose of maintaining like some ability to move.
Yeah, exactly. But in doing that, am I at a greater risk of injury personally, potentially, because the other 6 days of the week I'm predominantly moving in that sagittal plane?
That's a very hard question to answer. With the whole like injury prediction thing, that just like that doesn't exist. You can never tell, because with the dynamic activity like basketball, like there's so many different variables that can happen that could result in injury. Like somebody could like bump into you and you sprain your ankle or like tear your ACL. You can't control that. Doesn't matter what your training is like. Like those impact sports, like it's hard to control. If it's like a movement-based injury, like a non-impact, then you can say like, hey, maybe if your training was a little bit different, you had a little bit more movement options, like the term would be like movement variability. Your movement bandwidth wasn't so small, you could have possibly avoided this injury.
Mm-hmm.
And to go back to Mike, yeah, like if your training is more variable and you have control over that variable movement, theoretically, you should be able to avoid just like your typical like overuse or just like acute like sprained ankle or like knee sprain, something like that, those types of injuries. But you can never really say for sure. I'd be lying if I said, yeah, for sure, absolutely. But the theory, like the more variability you have with your movement, the more control you have over that variability, the less of a risk you're at.
So here would be the counterpoint to that. It would be that since we do have finite resources in terms of adaptive ability, is it worth my time to incorporate movements in different planes to decrease the risk of injury, which is already very low, when I could be doing more sagittal plane work, which would theoretically make me more jacked compared to something in a different plane?
So what's your goal?
To get as jacked as possible.
Then no, it's not, because you want to put all your resources towards that goal, right?
Exactly.
Right. So why would you do something that put you at a risk of getting injured? So like you answered your own question with that, because it really is context and goal dependent.
And
Right.
is it more so that's the answer in this scenario because the injury risk is already so low, or are you just saying in general that's the
In
answer?
general, like if your goal is just to be a healthy human being, like that would be the wisest thing to do, is to play sports that involve different movements, lift and build up resiliency for your body to, like, when there is like an impact, like maybe because you have more muscle, maybe that'll help you avoid an injury. But you're not training so much that you become that like sagittal play monster, and now that affects your ability to play other things or do other things. So it really is context. Right? If you're just trying to be a normal human being and stay healthy, then do as many different things as possible. If your goal is very specialized, then put all your resources towards that goal, but understand that there are going to be secondary consequences. And if you're okay with that, then keep on keeping on. If you're not, then add some variability to your life.
That was beautiful, man. Thanks for reinforcing my horrible movement capacity.
Yeah.
Cole, you want to take us into kind of our next sector question?
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about in the context of bodybuilding and powerlifting, preparing to train. Some people are on the foam roll 30 minutes prior to going into training. Some people do this, that, and the other. Any recommendations generally for what a good warm-up mobility routine include for getting ready to train for bodybuilding?
For sure. So this is your opportunity. The warm-up period is your opportunity to explore those more variable movements, right? Give yourself some variability within the warm-up period, and then like within the early warm-up period, this is where you can play around with the different movements that you would normally not do, like the frontal transverse plane movements. And as you get further into the warm-up, that is where you kind of specialize more into preparing yourself for what you're about to do. I'll give you an example of like things that I like to do. Going back to like the whole expansion compression thing, if you think about the things we like, say upper body training, right? You have like your bilateral rowing or pull-ups or pull-downs for your back training. So that involves like scapular traction, depression, all those activities, right? And then you set yourself up on a bench press or any sort of other pressing. You retract your scaps, you go into that same position, okay? And then at the same time, you're compressing the front side. So you have this anterior posterior compression of your upper thorax, right? Which will eventually, without getting into too much detail, result in a decreased ability to move out your shoulder joints, okay? Because you're just locking yourself into this position without an ability to move, right? You're pulling yourself back, you just lock yourself down. Okay. And I've talked to Mike about this, like the whole like the 2-to-1 like pull to push ratio, right?
Dr. John Russell,
Yeah.
bro.
Because it doesn't make any sense, because you're in the same exact position. If you're pushing right from that scap retracted position, okay, like you're there, and then you're pulling to counteract the effects of that, but it's the same exact movement, right? So undoing those things within your warm-up period would probably be a really smart idea. So driving protraction, expansion of your upper thorax would be a really smart idea. Things like bear crawls, or just even like a push-up where you're really reaching through, getting some serratus activation. Another thing that works really well from like the breathing standpoint is the idea of inversion. So what that means is just your hips are higher than your shoulders. So when you think about it, when you're standing up against gravity, as you breathe, your lungs fill up from the bottom up. Okay, and if you have a lot of compression in your upper thorax, you're not going to get any expansion there, right? So if you flip yourself upside down, you change that orientation of how your lungs fill. So now they fill from the top down, from the top down. So if you just reorient your body in your warm-ups to say like inchworms or high hip bear crawls, or just like sometimes I'll get on a GHR and just hang and just chill there and breathe. You'll bias yourself towards more upper thorax expansion, and you'll generally see like improvements in shoulder mobility. It's really interesting. It's like a fascinating thing to think about. But so what I'll do in the beginning of my warm-up is more like that kind of stuff, like inversion, and then like gym class movements, like your bear crawls, your crab walks, your inchworms. I'll do like some marching, skipping, things like that, just to get my body loose, to get myself moving in different ways that I would normally never move.
How long do you think this more or less takes you to get through?
So this is going back to like when Mike and I like first started hanging out. Like I think my warm-ups were like 30 minutes long. It was just like so absurd because I would try to do everything I possibly could, all the mobility drills, banded shit, like all this stuff that was so unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, my goal is to move a little bit and work up a sweat, increase my body like temperature, and I try to limit it to like no more than 10 minutes. I think that's all that's necessary.
That's fair, yeah.
Yeah.
We're gonna train after this. We're doing his warm up.
Yeah, I'm gonna do
Yeah, for sure.
That's what we're gonna do today because I would like to have I've kind of gotten into a rhythm with a warm up, and like specifically I always have like an extended push up where I'm really making sure I'm getting and I since I've incorporated that, like I think it helps. I think it makes me feel better, but I think there's other stuff that like I'm missing that could really benefit me if I kind of did some more variable stuff, considering how specific my training is.
Yeah. I mean, just from like a simple concept standpoint, okay, like you train in this one way, like you're always retracting, you're always extending. It would make sense that you would do something to counteract that, right? So
I'll even get like single leg stuff in, so I don't have a lot of my training. I even have like a lateral lunge, and just because this basic concept you instilled in me, like, hey man, like spend some time doing that stuff that like you might not spend your actual training. I think it helped, but I would love to learn more from you. And again, because we haven't trained together in a while, like, I want to see like what you're doing for your warm up now. Not the half hour stuff that I was previously exposed to, like you were talking about.
Also, I forgot to mention, I play around with like a lot of kettlebell stuff in my warm-ups. I'm not going to sit here and do like a full kettlebell training session because that's just not my goal to get really good at that. And it won't drive me towards like my strength and hypertrophy goals. But as a training concept, you think about like your kettlebell, like Turkish get-ups and arm bars, you're learning to move and control in those different planes of motion. That's not just agile. Like you have a lot of rotation going on, and then you have like the stability factor of actually like holding a kettlebell in an arm bar and like just different shoulder positions, which is great too for injury prevention. Make sense?
You're opening up my eyes to a lot of different things right now.
Yeah, we could totally play. We'll play around with stuff.
Excited.
When it comes into like the actual training part of it, for us Sagittal Plane Warriors, is there anything? Cause you kind of know how I train. I mean, even how like a traditional bodybuilder or powerlifter trains. Are there any movements which you think are underutilized for this population, which would actually, if they did use it, it'd be pretty conducive towards their goals, but it's just not really prevalent for whatever reason?
Yeah. And I know you know my answer to this because you already alluded to it like prior to this, but I think like just unilateral training is going to be one from like a strength and a hypertrophy standpoint. Like you'll get a really good hypertrophy stimulus from those exercises, but from a movement variability standpoint, going into like a single leg stance or a split stance, like even though you're still moving in the sagittal plane, there's a lot of frontal transverse plane control that has to happen at the joints for you to be able to accomplish those movements. So that right there is very valuable. So from like a lower body training perspective, your unilateral work is going to be really, really powerful.
Anything specific you like there? So like, you know, if we're thinking about unilateral stuff, like I'll just throw some out there too and tell me like if you prefer some over the others. Like a walking lunge, a stationary split stance,
Split squat.
and like a single leg press.
Okay, I'm very biased towards split squats.
Okay.
Because just the amount of control that has to go into it, you can kind of like fudge a walking lunge and make it look really shitty. But when you have to like stand in one position, learn to control and feel certain things, that becomes really powerful. So I'm very biased. Plus, you can do so many different things with it, like changing foot position, changing where your like back foot is, where your front foot is. Like you have like your front foot elevated, back foot elevated split squats. You can change the load, like goblet, holding 2 weights at your sides, like things like that. There's so many different options there that you can use to, one, train your legs, train the control, and then add a little bit of variation to the movement.
So tell me your thoughts on this. So currently, because it's not something I've used in the past, but it's something I'm really enjoying. And I do try to have pretty much all time some sort of unilateral work.
Yeah.
For upper and lower in my training. Right now, I love single leg press, and I will say this: at this point in time, I prefer it as my single leg, and I've done like walking lunges or split squats in the past. And this is kind of sad, but like I would put that.
Boy.
The coordination / like balance component and the stabilization requirements are higher in a lunge or split squat, and that compromises the motion I'm able to use.
Right.
And as far as from a hypertrophy standpoint, I feel like being able to lock into a leg press, which is very stable, I create my own stability, and I'm able to generate maximum force from that position. To me, while it may be like a little less functional, it might be a little less beneficial. But I'm still, working on potential asymmetry. But I feel like I'm able to so in a way that's more conducive to hypertrophy.
That's fair. You don't want to lose out on like the whole like stabilization and control aspect of it. That's so important. Even if you do get less of a hypertrophy stimulus. But if, like, again, it goes back to your original goal. Like, what is your goal? Is it to just be a fucking monster? Then, yeah, obviously, loading up a single leg leg press is going to be more valuable to you, as long as you're willing to accept the secondary consequences of that, of like less stabilization, less variability, because that's just inherently and it's always like a sliding scale. Like, right, you have like a low bar back squat on one end, and then like your single leg RDL or something on the other end, where there's a ton of control and not a lot of load. And then in between that, kind of like a single leg press.
All right.
Makes sense?
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense.
So maybe when you get closer to like you have like your training blocks where like you have a block that's solely focused on getting as much leg hypertrophy as possible, and then you have a block of like where you're like, okay, like I'm going to maintain what I have, and then I'm just going to explore, kind of like a variability block. Like this is where I'm going to play around with different stuff, kind of like reset myself so that I don't just keep driving the same stimulus over and over again until I get hurt.
I like it. How about for the upper body? Anything in particular? As far as the unilateral work goes?
Yeah, any unilateral, and especially like alternating activities. So you're one thing I love is like an alternating chest supported row, or a like just seated alternating pull down. So like going back to like the whole like thorax expansion and compression. So if you think of an alternating pull, somebody getting shot.
Something's going on outside.
If you think of a
can you go knock over there and be like, hey, can you guys shut up? We're doing a really important podcast over here.
If you think of like the whole concept of like compression expansion with a unilateral pull, the side that you're pulling on, you're compressing, right? You have concentric orientation of those muscles, but the contralateral side is expanding. right? So when you alternate, you're getting this alternating compression expansion on each side, which becomes really valuable, as opposed to a bilateral pull, which is just compression on both sides, right? So if the goal is to be variable in your movements, and if the overarching movement strategies that you have are compression and expansion, you want to be able to do both, right? So that alternating activity gives you that.
So I have a cable rope today. I particularly like doing it here because I like using mellows where I can have the individual handles,
Okay.
which works, but I do those at the same time. So you're saying it would be worthwhile to try one at a time. You know what I'm talking about? That cable rope.
So you pull with both arms at the same time?
So each handle, I pull at the same time, but I could theoretically.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you don't have like a double cable pulley, you could still do a single arm row, which is pretty valuable. If you want to add a little bit more of that alternating activity to it, or like a little bit more transverse plane activity, you can just reach with the opposite arm, right? And just alternate your arms. One arm has like the actual training stimulus. The opposite arm is just working through that compression expansion cycle. Pressing, same thing. Single arm is valuable. Alternating, like an alternating dumbbell press, with the whole concept of inversion. Something that I've been playing around with is a decline alternating press. Because again, you have that hips higher in the shoulders position, you're driving more expansion, your biceps more expansion in the upper forearms, and then you alternate and drive and shift like pressure side to side, shift volume side to side. So you get expansion compression, but you're also biasing more expansion overall. Makes sense.
No, I could listen to you talk for hours right now. This is wild.
Yeah.
I'm a little more exposed to arms concepts. Like I never had that. I get it. Cole, any more specific like programming question? What's coming to your mind as a PT student right now who knows more about this stuff conceptually than I do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to keep my thoughts in order a little bit over here.
You got a lot of them going.
Yeah.
Just flying around.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about how we're time training, and as we talk about unilateral work, specifically the lower body, as you say, you like to say like this right now. You don't have to worry about that stability factor. Mm-hmm. You put all your resources into getting that force through your quads, focused on for that. And then I think about right now, with walking lunges in one of my days, and I know if I haven't done it for a while, the very next day or two, feeling really fucked up.
Oh yeah, dude.
All this stabilizes working. It's the first time in like a while, and I definitely our point is valid in that I see the value in that because I don't want to become so locked in that position. I'm just like driving home that stimulus over and over again. But at the same time, at what cost is leaving some adaptations on the table that could be valuable, like trying to get as jacked as possible. Why aren't I just locking myself into this play?
Dude, it's fine. It's a fine balance.
Yeah, for sure.
It never has to be one or the other. Like you could always, like the whole concept of exercise selection, exercise variation, like just as long as you know the goal, right, for the block, like drive everything towards that goal, and then like reorient. Okay, like what's my next goal? Like I got this. Like now let's maintain this and.
Yeah, like you were saying, like it is probably potentially worthwhile to have maybe like every third block or something where let me be a little more variable in my movements.
Yeah. Or even a different concept too on that is like you have your training days, just finish up with some like feel good stuff. Right? Like you have like your lower day where you crush like barbell squats, you crush like the leg press and stuff, but finish up maybe with something that's not going to take a lot of energy and use a lot of resources, but like your single leg stuff, just finish up with that and you'll probably feel really good afterwards and not be totally like wasted from it.
Maybe like finishing a session with some walking lunges, probably a little bit lighter weight.
Like an easier exercise.
We're a little masochistic on the
yeah, for sure.
Going off that, do you have any cool down, if you will, techniques, or you do anything or you just end it, call it good? Maybe you don't do it personally, but it's in an ideal world, I guess.
Yeah, like just like what we talked about is like even if it's body weight, if you ever hear like Pat Davidson talk, he talks about the whole like sensory motor competency. Like if the movement feels good and or if a movement looks good and you feel the things that you're supposed to feel, that kind of checks off that competency that you're competent within that movement. Maybe thinking about more of like the feel aspect of the movement, like slow down, like you're doing your split squat or whatever.
Oh, I'm all about the feel, bro.
Yeah, I guess with bodybuilding, mind muscle connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
But slow down, feel what you're supposed to feel. Like with a split squat, maybe you're trying to shift into your hip, your front hip a little bit more. So maybe you feel like some adductor, some posterior hip. You have a slow tempo, right? It's not going to be, you're not loading it up like crazy and thinking that this is going to be like the thing that's going to drive your hypertrophy.
It's not your money maker for the
it's not your money maker.
You're already back
like,
squatting
you slow down the tempo, right? You're putting more thought into it, and that's like the period where you cool down. But then you feel things that you don't normally feel, and you leave feeling pretty good. Right, that kind of concept. I don't think you have to think about it like too much, or even like using your warm up as the cool down.
Yeah,
where because that's driving like the variability, right? Just going back to those like gym class exercises, just finish up with that. Right, unwind what you just did.
Gotcha. Cool. Anything else on that, Mike?
I don't personally. I feel like you might want to go with rapid fire at him right now.
Yeah, I don't know.
Holding everything back.
We technically have like one more like big picture question we can get into, but like if you just start throwing darts at
I think we can get into this next question, and as I formulate some like articulate thoughts.
There's some other questions too that like were not as in depth that we can cover too.
Yeah, so I'll ask this one. I'll arrange your thoughts. We might have some stuff to follow up with that.
Okay.
Here's our last kind of.
I'm very interested in subject.
Yeah.
This is my personal question.
Here's our last big rock. Good versus bad movement. Some common things that come to mind are knees over toes and squat from 1982.
I think it was 1983. Actually.
Round back deadlifts. Are some general forms of movement better than others? Do they have less inherent injury risk? Or are we all just a bunch of unicorns and we're all so unique in our anatomy and mobility that good and bad movements aren't real? Tell us.
I feel like this is a pretty easy answer, and I don't want to like diverge from it, but it's like, again, it all comes back to like goal and context, right? Like, what is your goal? That will drive what the movements are going to be. Okay, what's the context? Like, going back to like the unicorn thing, like you have like the prerequisite mobility to perform this movement, because there really is no bad movement. All movement is fine if it's within your goal, within your context, right? But do you have the things necessary to accomplish it? How technically, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the whole like knees over toes, like I think the concept came about because people thought it was like bad for your knees if they go over, like if you have any anterior translation of your tibia. It can tell, like, and I've seen people like have achy knees when they have an anterior translation, but typically they just don't have the programmed flexion to allow that movement, so they translate way towards their forefoot, and that puts more stress through their knees. It's like, okay, it's not necessarily the movement that's bad, it's like you don't have the necessary things to be able to accomplish the movement correctly. So that's really what it comes down to. So no, I don't think they're bad movements. I think they're just bad.
So what do you think about on Instagram when someone goes 1RM deadlift and their back is like a C? And everyone in the comments is like, oh, this dude's going to break his spine, and obviously this is wrong. What an idiot.
Again, like with as far as like strength wise, there are going to be certain positions that are going to allow you to produce more force. the whole like standard deadlift position is a standard because that's probably like the most, I don't want to say ideal because there are no ideals, but like the most ideal position to allow you to lift the most amount of weight. Once that position is compromised, then you're leaving weight on the table, right? That's why it's a standard. Whether it's going to be an inherent increased risk of injury, who knows? Maybe.
With the deadlift position, would you say it's more about the position you lock in from the start compared to like the load pulling you into a compromised position? Like if someone starts out with a ground back, they lock that in, pull through compared to someone who sets up nice, neutral, stereotypical textbook form, and then as soon as they initiate the pull, they get pulled into a seat. Would you say that increases the injury risk?
I think it's like the change of position through the lift that I guess theoretically would be the increase in injury risk. Because if you look at like strongmen, right? Like they watch a strongman lift an Atlas stone, right? They're totally around. They have like a global flexion position, right? But they're able to brace in that position and then lift the stone, and they're still flexed. They don't get injured, or I mean, theoretically, like they're not putting themselves in an increased injury risk because they're maintaining that position. They're able to brace that position and lock in. Whereas someone who, like you said, starts in a quote unquote neutral position and then just cat backs it, like that would theoretically have an increased injury risk.
I mean, like as far as like competing in powerlifting, the people I coach at powerlifting meets, just the other people I see at powerlifting meets, man, you don't see people just like stick a quote unquote neutral spine on like the third attempt ever.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say like I don't see that.
Yeah.
So like from that perspective, if you're like this more flexed or compressed position, like they're getting into it because it's conducive to lifting the most load, more or less. Or
no? What, like them losing position is actually them getting into their strongest position?
Yeah.
Could be. I typically view it as like their inability to maintain their pressure. Like they can't create or maintain enough pressure to maintain the position, so they just kind of fall into this almost like passive, like I don't even know how to word this.
So like I guess like I'm kind of wondering if it would just be like beneficial to these people, like if you know you're always gonna go there, like would it just be beneficial to start out a little more flexed in your starting position and lock that in? If you just like can't ever stay neutral, or would you say like no, you just have to like back down 85% and like affect your neutral spine?
That would allow you to get stronger in that position that you're going to be in anyways, so that would make sense.
So yeah, because I think that's the thing. Like people get so caught up and they're like, you know, they're evaluating their footage, especially in powerlifting. You're always videos and stuff, and they're just like, well, I have to lift with a neutral spine. This neutral spine is just it's the healthiest, most functional position, and they always try to set up that way, and they don't maintain it. And like people will respond and be like, well, you should obviously just back down to the most amount of load you can handle and maintain that neutral spine. It's like they're a powerlifter trying to lift the most weight possible, and if they try to lift the most weight, they become flexed. Maybe they should just starting out slightly flexed. You know what I mean? Within reason.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because like the whole like injury risk with like the spinal flexion too. All that research was done on like cadavers, as far as like the disc herniations happening in those in like the flexion moment, which obviously like things change when you're looking at like a living human organism, right? You're not looking at a dry cadaver. I think the flexion moment does put more like pressure on like your intervertebral discs, but who's to say like that's what's going to injure you?
And if you're going to go there anyway, right? If you're going to go there anyway, and it's because like your initial form being compromised, like if you could brace that, like slightly flexed position and just like rigidly maintain it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I guess everything goes back to like the 7th principle too, because if this is like, you just had this idea at a powerlifting meet during your 3rd attempt, you're like, okay, I'm going to start flexing it in the pull. Like that might be a bad idea because your body hasn't adapted to that. You just end up fucking yourself up anyways. So maybe like making sure you train that position and are able to actually like maintain and get strong in that position would be like the important takeaway there.
That makes a lot of sense. It's just like, because again, like, I mean, just social media is cancer. We don't touch on that on here, but it's just like, you know, any, like, there's just textbook definitions, and then you see people getting roasted on social media because
it's never black and white. There's always the gray area, and that like nobody wants to live in that gray area. You want like a black or white answer.
Yeah,
it becomes tough.
Answer.
Yeah,
it's carbs, bro.
Yeah,
it's carbs, bro.
Yeah, with a complex organism, like there's never one right answer either. That's the problem too. Like, do you ever hear the saying, "There's more than one way to skin a cat"?
Right. Yeah.
Like really, that in reality, that's what it is, and it becomes hard to think about because you want the thing, but it just doesn't exist.
Cole, anything you want to bang on here?
Yeah, I guess kind of in line with it, but separate in itself. So,
I want to talk about posture in general.
Yeah.
So,
like your posture right now is really bad.
Yeah, but are there good versus bad postures or weight positions? So people, like the way I was sitting, hunched over, shoulders forward, is something like that inherently bad in itself, or is it like context?
Can I answer this with a question?
Sure.
Okay. How do you measure good posture?
If it's
all right, Socrates, can I answer your question?
so it's something that's energy efficient for the person.
So define energy efficient. Like, what is it? Do you have an objective way of measuring? I'm going to answer this because no, there is none. There's no objective way. Like, hey, that's like there's this theoretical good posture, but really, like going back to our earlier conversation of being adaptable, like that's what you want. You want posture that's adaptable. You don't want to have one posture because, like we talked about with training the same way over and over again isn't good, right? You need to have all your postures, right? If you're crawling through a 3-foot tunnel, like what's good posture then? Can you maintain a perfectly upright spine and walk through that? No, you need to adapt to that, to whatever you're doing, to your context, to your environment. As long as you can do that, then you're fine. Like I don't think about like, oh, like that's good posture. But in theory, like if you're stuck in one position, like you can't move out of the posture that you're in, no matter what it is, whether you're perfectly upright or you're totally flexed. That's not good either.
Yeah, like for example, you see people working office 9 to 5, they're constantly seated in that.
Right. So that'd be a lack of variable movement. Not necessarily the specific position that they're in. Mm-hmm. It's their inability to move out of that position that's the problem. Now they're putting more pressure and tension on the same structures over and over again, and then you get like the back pain and things like that. It's not necessarily the position's not the problem. It's their inability to move in other ways that's the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and that may be like particularly worse if that same 9 to 5 person who slouched over all day doesn't lift weights and they don't do anything that provides some variability or like strengthen structures which oppose what they're usually in, right?
Yeah. The whole idea is having movement options, having adaptability to your environment. If you can't do that, then that's when you start to have problems.
But aren't you supposed to go out of your way to maintain this erect?
Yeah, that's just the
24/7.
The concept of that doesn't make any sense because it's like, how do you know that they're there? Like when you say good posture, how do you know what are you looking at? What is telling you? It just doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. There's no objective way to measure it. It doesn't make any sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
You can use that in school when your professor says good posture.
We talked about it. It's like there's 3 keys to like have good posture. I forget what all 3 of them were at the time, but I like your answer way more than the one we were given.
Yeah. Again, it comes down to like things just aren't as simple as that. Like with a complex with a complex system. It's just never, there's no right answer.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else you come to mind right now?
I'm good. He gave me the reinforcement I needed to keep doing what I'm doing. I just wanted to confirm my bias.
Yeah.
I wanted this conversation. I was like, he's either going to be like, whatever, dude, like, your goals, keep doing it, or you're going to be like, man, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. You need to start doing X, Y, and Z. He confirmed my bias. We're good from my standpoint.
By the way, I forgot to mention this in the beginning of the episode, but I reserve the right to be wrong on everything I've said today. Just putting that out there. So now you can't call me out on anything I say.
So when more research comes out, someone listens to this 3 years later when we
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll say if your ear, your shoulder, and your hip are in perfect alignment, that's good posture. I'm like, fuck.
It also means you're shocker.
Yeah. Unlike Cole's.
Unlike mine, yeah.
Well, all right. Artem, hopefully we'll have you back on soon. We can,
Sorry, no.
or maybe not.
I thought this was a one-off thing.
All right. Yeah. Cool. But it was a pleasure having you. I
Thanks,
really appreciate
guys.
your insight and learning a little bit more about your background today. I
Absolutely.
definitely learned a lot and learned that even in my short time in physical therapy school, I know absolutely nothing. So
And you will continue to do so for the rest of your life.
keep
And
my
it's
eyes and
okay.
ears open and just really critical. of
And your
what I
chakras.
think I know. And my chakras. Yeah. Mike, always great having you on my site, helping orchestrate and facilitate the conversation. And hope to be back for that episode again soon.
Probably be in like a month, right? Like probably after finals.
Might be in a month. I got my finals coming up, so schedule a little bit hectic right now. But whenever we can get an episode out, if you do, we will be sure to do that. All right. We will catch you on the next one. Thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks,
Take
guys.
care.